Hi. KEYSTEP 2 is a new way to look at improvisation and composition. You feed it a simple ARP pattern, then mutate it, and mutate again if you don't like what you get. Once you're happy, throw the pattern into the sequencer, and you can play on top of it using the keyboard. You can then continue to mutate the sequence, and if you like, turn that into an arpeggiator pattern and start the whole thing all over again. Besides that, it's got improvements on pretty much every aspect of the original. It's got more arpeggiator options, a better sequencer with automation, undo, overdub, and more pattern storage, better I/O and control for your modular gear, and now has a new small screen to make parameters more accessible. In this video, I'll take a look at what makes it special, my top favorite features, as well as everything else in depth, how it compares to the original KEYSTEP, KEYSTEP 37, and pros and cons compared to the competition overall. Before I start, a quick disclosure, Arturia sent me KEYSTEP 2. Other than that, no money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, before I jump into the fun generative stuff, a bit of an overview. KEYSTEP 2 has 4 main modes. You can use it as a regular MIDI keyboard with velocity sensitivity and mono aftertouch, meaning regardless of which key you apply pressure to, aftertouch will impact all the notes you play. Then the second main mode is chord mode, which lets you transpose a single chord across the keyboard. You can customize it to play any chord you want, and it has various strum and other options we'll talk about later. Anyway, the third mode is arpeggiator mode, but there are plenty of new rhythmic and polyphonic shapes, including an interesting sequence to ARP feature that lets you use a sequence as the basis for an arpeggiator pattern, as well as an arpeggiator to sequencer option, where if you like the sequence that's played or mutated, you can store that as a sequence for later use. And then the fourth main mode is sequencer mode, which, as the name implies, lets you play back a sequence, which you can either transpose or play on top of, like I showed you in the intro. And when you play on top of a sequence, those notes can be sent on a separate channel. You can store up to 64 patterns on board in 4 banks of 16 patterns each. Sequences can have up to 8 notes per step, so they're polyphonic. And they can also store expression parameters like mod and pitch strips, aftertouch, and even spice, which we'll talk about. Sequences can be up to 64 steps long, quantized or unquantized, and you can chain sequences if you want to create longer compositions. KEYSTEP 2's generative features, mutate and spice, are layered on top of both the sequencer and the arpeggiator. They let you intelligently randomize both, and it also has a scale mode to align any note you play to the root and scale of your choice from over 15 options, and you can apply custom scales to sequences. Also new compared to the other KEYSTEPs is a small but high-resolution screen to show you parameter values. This lets you configure various settings, and it also acts as a visual metronome if you're recording sequences. It's not as good as hearing an actual click, but I guess better than nothing. The screen has a companion detent push encoder and back button, so you can use it to enter menus, select items, edit values, and go back if you want. And besides the global menu, you can also long press various items to enter their menu. KEYSTEP 2's keys are mini keys with aftertouch, like I mentioned. And note that not all mini keys are created equal. Some vendors offer more cramped mini keys that aren't as deep or wide. And Arturia is the only company that I know of that makes these mini key MIDI keyboards with aftertouch. KEYSTEP 2, like others in the series, has touch strips for pitch bend and modulation. And like the others in the series, there's a shift key to access all the parameters in blue across the keys and the buttons, as well as sequence and arpeggiator, gate length, and spice using the touch strips. So by default, they control pitch and mod, but if you hold shift, they control gate and spice. In terms of build, KEYSTEP 2 feels solid. The enclosure is all plastic, so there's no metal base like the original. It doesn't feel less sturdy, and it does make it quite light. For connectivity, we've got USB-C for power and MIDI, as opposed to micro USB no one will miss on the original KEYSTEP. And there's an on-off switch. There are no more dip switches for selecting clock modes. You do that in the menus. You've got MIDI in and out, full-size 5-pin DIN MIDI, analog sync in and out, and if you use a TRS cable, you can use the tip for clock and the ring for start-stop. It's got a sustain pedal jack that actually also supports expression pedals too, self-promotion alert, but you can use any expression pedal to get this to send expression CCs to whatever it is you're controlling. And if you want to control Eurorack or modular gear, you've got CV and gate to trigger notes and set their pitch, along with a little vibrato LFO for pitch, and 2 assignable mod CV outputs, which you can assign any number of sources to, as you can see here. Okay, so that's it for the overview. Let's dive right in. And rather than start with the basics of how to use the arpeggiator and sequencer, I want to start with the compositional tools in KEYSTEP 2, and I'll fill in the blanks of the basics later on. The first interesting tool available here is the sequence to ARP feature. Let me explain how it works. So by default, KEYSTEP's arpeggiator comes with 15 built-in arpeggiator patterns, and some of them are nice new ones. There's the usual suspects. Let's go through these briefly. Up and down, and up and down, random, order played, and polyphonic, and a few other interesting ones, including a few monophonic rhythmic options, and a few polyphonic rhythmic options. So that's great, but perhaps most interesting is user ARP option number 16. So what this does is take the last sequence you used and use it as a reference to play an arpeggiator pattern. Let's select this and take a look at a few examples. For this to work, the sequence needs to be not empty. So I'll go in here and select bank 4 and say this pattern. So this is the basic pattern programmed into sequence 13 in bank 4. Now, if we go back to the arpeggiator and make sure we've selected user ARP, now what KEYSTEP 2 is going to do is going to try and arpeggiate through the notes I play based on the pattern that was programmed in that sequence. Now, if I only hold one note, it doesn't have much to go with, but if I add more notes, it will start to play them based on the groove and the feel of the sequence that I programmed. Let's maybe try a different one. So this pattern has a bit of polyphony in it. Let's maybe slow it down. So again, simply go into arpeggiator mode, and as long as we're in user ARP, we can immediately use it. Again, if we only give it one note to latch onto, it'll just play one note, but if we give it more notes, it'll start to build on that. And if I give it all the notes that were in my original pattern, it'll play my original pattern. But the beauty is that we can now give it different notes. It's still going to use my sequence as a reference, but play the notes I hold on the keyboard as opposed to the notes in the sequence. And it will also keep the rhythm of the pattern. So let's try this one, for example. You can see this has a rhythm. It's not just a continuously strummed ARP. Let's go back into the arpeggiator. Again, make sure we're on user ARP. So let's try this. With one note, we just get the rhythm, but let's add more notes. So all this is an improvisation on this core idea. So that's the first interesting compositional tool here. The second one is the ARP to sequence feature, which, as its name implies, takes whatever you're playing. Let's maybe hold it. And if you like that, just press Shift and to sequence. And now that's been copied to this slot. So now I have it stored as a sequence. I can edit it, by the way, as a sequence, or save it. So if you've ever come up with a cool ARP pattern and wanted to save it, you can do that. That said, you can't record an entire ARP progression into the sequencer. So there's that for the wish list. And by the way, you can also long press record to send an ARP to the sequence. Anyway, so that's nice, but nothing particularly generative about this. Where things get more interesting is if we involve the mutate function. Mutate works both on ARP patterns and on sequences. Let's start with ARPs. So let's say, get this going. A short press makes a small change. And the longer you press, the more things get messed up or complex. And if you don't like what you hear, then you can keep going. And if you do like what you hear, that now becomes the new ARP pattern. So regardless of what you play, that's now our pattern. So if you ask me in the comments how many ARP patterns it has, the answer is as many as you want. That also works, by the way, with octaves. Up to 4 octaves. Maybe let's go a bit lower. So, I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty wild that a mutated pattern just becomes an ARP pattern. And we can mutate again, of course, if we don't like what we're hearing. If we want to go back to the up pattern, we can just hit Shift and reset, but I think we're beyond that now. Really cool stuff, and if we like what we hear, of course, we can send this ARP to a sequence. Again, either Shift or to sequence, or long press on overdub, and it now has become a sequence. A fixed sequence we can save for later. Speaking of which, Mutate also works on sequences. Now, if you excuse the cheesiness, I'm going to try and run Mutate on this pattern. While it may not always work well on long patterns, let's see what happens here. Now, since Mutate shifts notes around, things might get messy with more complex patterns. The thing is, if you want to explore and are willing to risk a few odd mutations, you might just encounter something good, which can be an interesting variation on an old theme. As you can hear, a short press sometimes mutates only part of the sequence. And if you like what you hear, you can always save it into an empty pattern. Okay, let's move on to the next interesting compositional tool, and that's Spice and its companion, Rolling the Dice. Spice is a more gentle form of randomization. The interesting thing about it is that you can use the touch strip to apply different degrees of spice. So let's say, for example, use this very simple pattern. As I apply spice, the draft manual that I have says it changes gate length and adds ratchets, but I've heard it also transpose octaves and, as you can hear, change velocity. And I can triple tap to roll the dice and then get a different spice variation. And again, this is a continuous parameter, so I can roll back the spice as it morphs back to my original pattern. It's kind of like having a performer that slightly improvises on your core pattern as opposed to Mutate, which can completely change things. Spice is non-destructive, so you can always scale things back. Spice, by the way, can also be saved to a sequence. Long press on overdub. Now it's copied into a sequence. Another interesting twist with the way the arpeggiator works, if we just take a standard pattern and use octaves on it, then it'll do as expected. Just play the same pattern over and over again across different octaves. But if you choose one of these modes, let's say this one, or let's say go with this one, and then add octaves to that, then it won't just repeat the pattern, it'll sort of spread apart across more octaves. Let's try this one with 1 octave. And then add another octave. So those are the main new tools I found inspiring for generating ideas. KEYSTEP 2 does have a couple more that we're already used to seeing in other MIDI controllers, and these are scale and chord modes. Scale mode forces any notes you play onto one of your choice of scales. So let's say go for minor in this case. It'll just repeat the same note if you press a key that isn't in the scale. And then an interesting generative technique we also saw in KEYSTEP 37, you can define a user scale for when you use sequences or patterns. And the idea here is that you choose which keys you want to disable, and those won't be played when you run a sequence. So that's also an interesting generative tool, I think. And then the chord mode is also a similar implementation to the chord mode in KEYSTEP 37. We're reminded here, by the way, that we're still forced into the minor scale. Let's maybe disable that for now. Anyway, with a long press, you can choose one of several preset chords. Or of course, just play a user chord. So this is our chord. Let's maybe go for something simpler. And then we've got the same parameters as in KEYSTEP 37, only here they're in a menu. So let's take a look at these. Spread. We'll add more notes. Up to 16, which is pretty wild. Or have it based on velocity. Or aftertouch to spread. And then we've got strum, which can be not tempo synced or tempo synced. Then we've got a few strum types. That's the default. Of course, chords transpose, so we can do this. Then finally for chords, we've got a voicing option. As the name implies, voicing tries to voice the chords more elegantly than just simply transposing them up and down. And you can also add a bass note. It would be nice if you could send the bass note on a separate channel. Currently, all the notes are sent on the same channel. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the sequencer. Like I mentioned, you can store sequences in banks of 16 sequences. Let's go for, say, bank 2 and pattern 5 or 4, which I know are empty. A long press on the sequencer button opens up the sequencer menu with a bunch of options. And the first one is just to erase the sequence. Let's start with step sequencing. You can just hit record and start entering steps into the pattern. The pattern length will grow as you add steps. You can add polyphonic steps, up to 8 notes per step. As you can see, hold adds a rest, and pressing a key and then pressing hold adds a tie. If you press hold and play notes, then this phrase will be played back legato. And this may be the messiest pattern ever, but let's listen to it. Let's slow it down maybe. But as you can see, rests and ties were entered as expected. If you like, you can also go in and edit a pattern with a screen encoder. So you can just replace the notes as you go along. If you want, you can use the screen encoder to edit specific notes in a chord and then This screen is also a good way to find out you need a new reading glasses prescription. So that's, I think, pretty much everything you need to know about step sequencing. Let's long press and erase this. You can also play live into a pattern. For this, you'll want to set a pattern length, a sequence length, which you can do in these menus. You can also add to the sequence length with a long press on this button and using these numbers. So I could add steps in increments of 1 or 8, and I could then live record into this, which is, like I said, a bit hard with this metronome, but you can if you want. So let's try something. By the way, you could choose to record quantized or non-quantized. These are quantization settings if I want to apply quantization. But you can choose to record either with or without quantization. If you want, you can replace notes in a pattern. Just hit record, and anything you play will replace what was there before. And if I didn't like what I did, there's actually an undo. So you replace notes with record, and then with shift record, the LED turns blue, and you can overdub or overlay new notes onto the pattern. Now, like I mentioned, we can also record automation. For example, the mod wheel, and you can see that loop on the MIDI monitor, or pitch bend. So that loops too. And if that's too much, which it is, you can always go in and clear automation. Say, for example, clear the pitch bend. We could also clear these parameters. And then we've got a few sequencing tools here. We can nudge the pattern back and forth or transpose it. Octaves up and down. Double it if we want. And just clear it if we've had too much. Clear only clears the notes in a pattern, as opposed to pattern init, which clears everything. As we saw earlier, undo can undo recordings. There's only one layer of undo, and if you step record into a pattern, then you can undo individual steps. You can see it goes back in time. So that does have multiple levels, though it didn't shorten the sequence. Once you've got a pattern recorded, let's go for this one. Then if you press hold, you can transpose it. Or if you don't, you can play on top of it either in the same channel or on a different channel. Which is something you determine in the settings. It's called the keyboard play channel. Beyond that, you can also swap sequences live. So let's say I've got this sequence going, bank 4, preset 13, then swap to pattern 14, or back to 13. Notice that it moved to the sequence that I swapped to at the end of the previous sequence. If you want, you can change that with wait until load, so either at the end, instantly, or at the end of one bar. Each sequence has a tempo stored in it, and you can choose to use that or not with use pattern tempo. And if you don't want to bother with swapping sequences manually, you can also chain them with the chain option. Just select the patterns you want to chain. So let's say that I want this to play 4 times, and then this to play 4 times. Then go back to this. I can also edit this with the screen encoder. So I can just play this, freeing me to mess about with my synth. So that's sequencing. A few things that are both common to sequences in arpeggiators. You've got time division control. And this happens on a per pattern basis, by the way. So you can see only one of the patterns is accelerating, but not this one. So I can swap to that pattern change its time division. This one, make it fast, and this one, make it fast. Now they're both fast, so there's time division per sequence. And then you can also use subdivisions, like triplets, dotted. So that's that. Time divisions also work for the arpeggiator. Now I think we covered all of the arpeggiator features as we went along. Maybe just one thing that I didn't cover. The arpeggiator also has its menu. There's not much going on there, but it does have one interesting feature. You can set an arp length, and then if you turn on retrigger, let's say go for a simple pattern. In this case, let's say that I play a 3-note pattern. You can see it resets after 16 steps. Maybe slow it down a bit. And you can set that to any number of steps. A few other miscellaneous items. If we hit the metronome menu, you'll see that we've got a swing option. So that would work as you'd expect. You can also set the time divisions here if you want, but it's much faster using the time division up, down, and subdivision key. Another little tidbit, if you press hold, then you can keep adding notes to arpeggiated patterns as long as you're holding one key down. So that's a way to use the arpeggiator as a little mini sequencer. And of course we can mutate this if we wanted. Another little tidbit, when the arpeggiator and sequencer are off, hold works like a sustain pedal. You can send program changes from sequences if you want, to keep your synth in sync with your sequences. And then you can change the velocity curves and aftertouch curves of the keyboard. I recommend you do this and explore what works best for you. For example, for me, I prefer exponential. It gives me more precise control over aftertouch. Finally, before we head out to the pros and cons, you can use Arturia's MIDI control center to edit both device settings and pattern settings. You can't edit the actual pattern like you can on the KEYSTEP or KEYSTEP 37, but if you prefer this to diving into the menus here, then you can. You can also back up your patterns here. That said, the beauty of KEYSTEP 2 is that you don't need this. All of these parameters are accessible in the menu here. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for KEYSTEP 2. On the pros side, MIDI controllers are increasingly getting smarter and more powerful. They're long past just sending out MIDI notes. And with KEYSTEP 2, a new benchmark has been set for what a keyboard can do as a compositional assistant. The way you can send arp patterns to the sequencer and back, along with how you can mutate and spice things up along the way, is truly unique. At least I've not seen anything like it. Besides that, the arpeggiator, sequencer, and CV outputs have been substantially improved on every level beyond the original KEYSTEP and even KEYSTEP 37, which I think is feeling pretty jealous now of things like the increased pattern storage, parameter automation, and more. Then finally, on the pros side, the new screen means you don't need the MIDI control center to edit various parameters. You can do everything on board here, and this obviously opens up additional features which you couldn't get if you didn't have a screen like this. I think the MIDI keys here, by the way, are also a pro, both because they have aftertouch and because of their relative size compared to some other MIDI keys which are much more cramped. So those are the pros. On the cons side, while KEYSTEP 2's form factor is an advantage in that you're pretty much as close as possible to the synth you're using it with, it doesn't have pads, faders, or knobs to control synth or DAW parameters, unless you count the mod strip and using an external expression pedal. Also, the pitch and mod strips aren't wheels, so it's easy to hit them accidentally with an errant pinky. And finally, on the hardware side, while it's great that the screen is here, it's pretty small, or at least the fonts on it and the way that it's arranged results in really small letters. I think they can improve on this, by the way, in a firmware update. So for example, if I want to change the tempo, there's a lot of empty screen space here. And this applies to pretty much any other parameter. So if you just take tempo and BPM and move them to the right or to the left, you can double the height and width of the actual number, making it much easier to see as opposed to this small thing. And like I said, same goes for anything else. So say selecting MIDI channel, a lot of empty space and a really small number. I think this can and should be rearranged differently. Then beside that, I have quite a long wish list of things I'd like for them to add here. For example, the octaves don't work on user arps. It would also be great to be able to change MIDI channels just by using Shift, and these numbers, these are used in ARP and sequencer modes, but if you're out of these modes, then shift and pressing these doesn't do anything. Besides that, I encountered a few small bugs here and there, but Arturia is pretty good at fixing these. A bit more feedback. Spice is really fun, but you need to press shift to access it. So if you press shift and change it and then play anything, you're actually not playing, rather you're changing the current sequence or the arpeggiator type. So it would be nice to be able to lock Spice, say, to the mod wheel and just keep that controlling Spice without using shift. If they don't do this, just be careful not to hold shift and change anything while you're editing Spice. Another small item on my wish list, you can set velocity to fixed, but you can't set the number that it's fixed to. It's fixed to 100, it would be nice to lower it or increase it based on whatever the patch does. So all these cons aside, I can tell you that whenever I'll look to be exploring new ideas, I'll be reaching for KEYSTEP 2. I think that 2 sequence or 2 arpeggiator along with Mutate and Spice makes this the one to beat for creative music making. So that's it for KEYSTEP 2. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.